The First Crusade would perhaps mark the greatest clash between civilizations since the Roman times. For the first time in centuries, Western armies would march across the arid steppes and plateaus of Anatolia, the mountains of Cilicia, and the fertile valleys of Levant, hidden behind arid landscapes. This clash between the Eastern and Western civilizations would showcase the starkly different militaries as well. In this video, I will be comparing the military prowesses of the Western and Islamic worlds just before the First Crusade. This is the Knight versus the Saracen. Before we get to the video, please subscribe. Enjoy. Armies are the products of their environments and their societies. And these factors were vastly different in the Islamic world and Western Europe. However, one thing was the same in both places. The cavalry reigned supreme. 11th century was an era of drastic military reform in both Latin Europe and the Middle East. And such a drastic change in military doctrine would not come around until 15th century, when disciplined infantry and gunpowder would once again revolutionize warfare. This revolution came in the form of Norman heavy cavalry in the west, and Seljuk Turkish horse archers in the east. The Norman knights were unmatched in the field of battle. Their deadly charges flattened undisciplined infantry in an instant, regardless of their numbers, as demonstrated in the battles of Cerami and Civitate, where the Norman knights had scattered masses of infantry with simple frontal charges. The Norman knights then proceeded to prove their worth against the most disciplined infantry forces of the era, in Hastings against the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls, and in Dyrrhachium against the Eastern Roman Varangians. By 1096, the Normans had founded kingdoms for themselves in England, Normandy, and southern Italy. What made the Norman shock cavalry tactics so revolutionary was their ability to combine light and heavy cavalry tactics. Armored and heavy cavalry was not new or revolutionary. The Persians, the Parthians, the Seleucids, and then the Romans had used cataphracts with success. However, the heavy cataphract tradition of the antiquity was usually too heavy to play the decisive role as the Norman knights had. The latest surviving cataphract specimen, the Byzantine cataphractoi, was covered in armor from head to hooves. He was equipped with lance, bows, maces, and swords. However, it was not shock cavalry. The cataphract did not do devastating charges. The cataphracts instead usually trotted at a medium pace. The cataphracts could not reform and recharge, unlike the Norman knights. And this was the defining difference between the Byzantine cataphract and the Norman knights. The knights were in a flexible formation, and they could charge repeatedly without getting bogged down in static melee by the enemy infantry. And no medieval army could stand up to repeated Norman heavy cavalry charges. The European knight performed best at open but restricted fields, such as open valleys and farmlands carved into the forests, which were the most common terrain types in Europe. These fields gave the knights open ground to charge on the enemy, but also restricted an enemy with superior mobility from wide maneuvers on the flanks, and no one could beat the knights in head-to-head combat. Of course, the Crusader armies did not only consist of knights or the heavy cavalry. The small elite knightly corps was supported with levies, mounted and dismounted sergeants, bowmen, and crossbowmen. The Western short bows used during this time period were inferior to the Eastern variants in range and power, and the powerful longbow would not appear until 13th century. Only the Hungarian and Byzantine composite bows could match the Turkish ones, though neither Hungarians nor the Byzantines would be a core part of the Latin Crusader armies. However, what the Crusaders lacked in bows, they made up with crossbows. The crossbow was also inferior in many aspects to the Turkic composite bow. It was outranged by the nomadic bows and could not be used for indirect fire. However, depending on the crossbow variant, it had better penetration in closer range, it worked in humid conditions, and more importantly, crossbowmen were easy to train. A good archer took years to train, meanwhile the crossbowman could be adequately trained in just 2 months. And the last, and maybe the most important defining characteristic of the Western warfare were castles and fortresses. Western Europe was covered with thousands of fortresses, and Western Europeans built the most advanced fortifications on Earth. These fortresses were utilized by the feudal lords to control the narrow forested roads and mountain passes of the Western European landscape. Assaults were extremely bloody, and sieges were lengthy and expensive. Although fortresses would fail at area denial in the vast plains of Inner Anatolia, the mountainous coastline of Levant was just as suitable. To conclude everything, the best path for the Western army to victory was utilizing its knights in closed spaces to deadly effect, and then strategically denying the area to the enemy with use of solid fortresses, and the mountainous Levantine coast was very suitable for this type of warfare. On the opposing side, we have the Saracen armies. During the First Crusade, we can see 2 distinct Islamic army doctrines: the Fatimid Shia army and the Sunni Seljuk army. The Fatimid army was clearly the much weaker of the two. It was a remnant of the long-gone Islamic Golden Age, not only heavily outdated, but also in serious decay institutionally as well. The Fatimid army doctrine could be traced back to the Abbasid army of 9th century. It had a very small professional corps made of slave soldiers, commonly known as the Mamluks, that was supported by tribal levies. However, very much like the modern Arab armies of 20th and 21st centuries, the Fatimid army was not designed to win foreign wars, but to control its own populace. Professor Yakov Lev writes, "The inherent weakness of multi-ethnic armies, their susceptibility to such divisive methods, came paradoxically to be regarded by the political thinkers of medieval Islam as an advantage to a regime which, by use of these divisive methods, was able to enhance its position." The Fatimid army was divided deeply along the ethnic lines. The first group was the Berber Kutama. The Kutama were the founders of the Caliphate in North Africa. However, they had gradually lost their military and political power, as the Fatimid caliphs pursued centralization. They usually fought as light cavalry and skirmishers. Another notable group were the Turkic Mamluks. These were slaves trained to be professional soldiers. In Fatimid Caliphate, they mainly occupied the role of horse archers and medium cavalry, not to be confused with the heavier Mamluk cavalry of the later Mamluk Sultanate. They would be equipped with lances, bows, sabers, and maces, and would be lightly armored. The last major group were the Abid, or the Black Soldiers. These were Nubian slave soldiers and were the most numerous among the three by 11th century. They mainly fought as lower quality infantry and archers. Now, this army was outdated even under the best circumstances, and even if the system worked as intended. However, there is no point in discussing the system's weaknesses at length, as the system did not survive into the First Crusade. The army structure, as quoted before, was created purely due to political reasons. The caliphs hoped to use these ethnic military branches against each other to retain their power and influence, and actively sought discord among their own army. This method worked for them until it did not. In 1060s, the clashes between the groups started resembling a civil war. Especially the Turks and the Blacks fought each other in the streets regularly. These clashes lasted until 1067, when it escalated into a full-on civil war between the Turks and the Blacks. Initially, the Turks were successful. They massacred the Blacks in Lower Egypt. However, the Blacks managed to fend off further Turkish attacks in Upper Egypt, where the climate was less favorable to Turkic cavalry. The stalemate lasted for a few years, until the Turks started fighting each other for the spoils of war. The civil war continued until 1075, when Badr el-Jamali, an Armenian Mamluk warlord from Palestine, arrived with his private army made of Armenians and restored order. After 10 years of war, the Fatimid army was in shambles. The Black regiments and the Turks were purged by el-Jamali in his attempt to consolidate power. And maybe more importantly, the Fatimid state was in ruins. Its cities were sacked and its treasury looted by the various factions in the civil war. Now, this may not have brought a military disaster for a less centralized state like the Seljuks or the feudal kingdoms of Western Europe, as in those realms, individual knights and warriors armed and trained themselves. However, in Egypt, the centralized government was everything. The army was equipped, fed, and paid by the state. With the Fatimid state bankrupt, the Fatimid army was reduced to a rabble of undisciplined infantry and some light tribal cavalry. There was no force in Fatimid Egypt that could hope to stop a nightly charge, and the only thing that would save them from total annihilation was the inhospitable Sinai desert. The Sinai had protected the Fatimids from Seljuk Turks, and it would once again protect it from the Crusaders. The Seljuks were the real masters of the Islamic world. The nomadic Seljuk hordes, led by illustrious Sultans Tuğrul, Alparslan, and Malik Shah, had carved an empire that reached from Europe to Afghanistan. The Seljuk imperial army was made of tribal horse archers of the steppes. The nomads were equipped with lances, sabers, and bows, and made excellent light cavalry. They were highly mobile and superb horse archers. Their horses were light and fast, and their composite bows outranged all others. However, their real strength was their ability to employ hit-and-run strategies. In open terrain, they could hit when they liked and where they liked, and vanish back into the steppe. The slower enemy could either chase them, lose cohesion in the chase, and get ambushed, or do nothing, and slowly wither away under constant harassment. The nomadic army was extremely well suited to the arid landscape of inner Anatolia. Their horses could live off the grass, and the warriors themselves could live off their horses and their flocks in the open steppe. The Seljuk imperial armies from Persia also had large contingents of heavy Mamluk cavalry. This elite contingent was better armored than the tribal horsemen and could be utilized as the anvil to the light cavalry on the flanks. In 1090, the Seljuk military was one of the greatest war machines of its time. However, the fortune would favor the Crusaders. Malik Shah died in 1092, 4 years before the First Crusade. Malik Shah would be the last Sultan of the Seljuk Empire as a cohesive unit. His death was followed by a civil war between his sons in Persia and a complete collapse of any state authority outside of Persia. With the Imperial core out of the game, the heavy Seljuk Mamluks disappeared from the battlefield, and the Crusaders would only face the light tribal horsemen of local warlords. Now, these light nomadic armies were still very capable of beating the Western armies in the battlefield and the campaign map alike. The knights could be surrounded, pelted with arrows, then finished off with a feigned retreat in an open field. Or they could be worn down with constant harassment, forced to always march in battle formation, and slowed down to a crawling speed. Without access to shelter, food, and water, the Crusaders would wither away in these distant lands. However, these maneuvers required a chain of command, or at least a cohesive army, and this would be the main weakness of the Turkic armies during the First Crusade. The Turkic warlords, even when they were seemingly allied, saw each other as the bigger threat than the Crusaders. It was every tribe, every governor, every horse lord against each other. Despite the differences between the Fatimid and Seljuk militaries, one thing remained constant. The Muslim militaries lacked in fortifications. The life in the Middle East was organized around large urban population centers rather than rural estates. The cities were mostly fortified and walled, but there weren't adequate numbers of strategically placed castles to deny the area to the enemy. Once the enemy was beaten in the field, the Crusaders could relatively easily seize control. Overall, the Crusader armies were clearly superior to the Muslim armies of the late 11th century. The Fatimid army was a rotten corpse from 2 centuries ago. Meanwhile, the Seljuk world, despite posing a formidable challenge with its horse archers and agile cavalry, lacked the required military cohesion to effectively fight. And the First Crusade would be a showcase of these key factors. Thank you for watching. I hope that I was able to give you a clearer idea on the Islamic and Crusader armies just before the First Crusade. If you liked it, please subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one.